I'm going to give some context. I used to live in Slate Springs, Minnesota as a kid. I lived in the middle of nowhere with a giant meadow field about 5 miles long by 7 miles wide. I looked at my old house just to make sure it's correct. Our closest neighbor owned some of it and stored giant cylindrical hay bales there. I clearly remember it being my birthday and it was very cold outside. I had just turned 7 and was playing on my plastic little four-wheeler and I got a stick stuck in the wheel, so I got off and picked it off. I remember getting up and looking up to see a giant bird fly over the giant field in front of my house and landed on a hay bale, and it was clearly almost 3 times the size of a hay bale. I remember freezing and then watching as it took off, almost crushing the bale. I then went running inside crying, but parents thought I was talking about a raven or something. Has anyone else seen something similar? About a month ago, I told my dad about it, and he said he remembered the neighbor saying something about a bird. Hi, I live out in Central Oregon. Central Oregon is a vast high desert full of rattlesnakes, punishing high temperatures, and tons upon tons of dust. However, there is so much beauty out here where I live that it makes up for all the potential dangers of living out in the desert. Coyotes can be dangerous, and I know they will kill livestock and animals and horses, but one thing I'm not sure about is creatures that suck the blood out of other animals. I'm talking vampires. Okay, well, maybe not vampires in a traditional sense, because they are fictional. However, my dad and I are finding wild horses in groups and singular that are dead, with multiple sets of holes along their neck and drained of all blood. I'm talking 0 blood in the entire cadaver. There's no blood on the ground, and whatever poked a hole in the neck was so clean and precise. The same sets of holes can be found in the exact same locations on the other horses that we found. We have found deceased horses alone with these puncture wounds, and we have also found them in large groups, all dead. It's almost as if something walked right up to them, poked a hole in their neck, and walked away, and just let them bleed out. Except there's no blood, or evidence of any bleeding out for that matter. I'm not really sure how I'm going to explain it. It's just a weird supernatural phenomenon, because my mind goes to vampires. I have to stop that because it's been programmed that way because of how pop culture is. I know that vampires don't exist, and that there isn't a vampire going around drinking the blood of horses. When I cannot explain is why we're finding these wild horses dead over the past couple of months all of a sudden. It's actually been about the same time that we went into quarantine, so probably late March. Yeah, I would say about 2 months now. I want to say we've been probably finding up to about 30 to 40 dead wild horses in total, all having their blood be drained. I know people talk about UFO stuff, alien stuff, and all that weird abduction nonsense being out in the middle of nowhere, but what even drains the blood of a horse? We are pretty close with our neighbors that are around us, and we've checked in with them. They've been experiencing strange things, but no animals being killed or any blood being drained from anything. The one connection I could piece together potentially is that in the last 60 days, not only has more wild horses been showing up dead more than ever, but the dogs around the area have gone missing. I know that because I've been asked on several occasions already if I had seen several of our neighbors' animals. Animals just meaning dogs. There are the same dogs that I've seen around the area for years. Because I've been here for so long, I've gotten to know my neighbors and people around us very well, and they've had the same animals for a long time. You know, something is up when the same animals just get up and go missing within a 60-day time span. And now, all of a sudden, these horses are just dropping dead in the middle of the night? Something just doesn't add up. I've thought about calling the cops, but really, what are they going to do? If it's somebody doing this, they're going to get caught eventually. But I don't know. Who goes out and murders random wild horses? And you would think if they're kidnapping the dogs, wouldn't you find the dogs somewhere? I guess I'm just thinking out loud at this point. See, my dad is a stickler, just like me, and firmly stands by that it's a coyote. I'm a skeptic just as much as anybody, but even I think that's total bullshit, and that he's just being in denial about something more here. What does more even mean? That is what I'm trying to figure out. Could it be that there is some unknown animal out of the desert draining these horses' blood? Why hasn't anybody seen it? I suppose it's possible for a pack of rabid coyotes to be killing all the local dogs, but I still feel like we would find cadavers with how much my dad and I travel in the outback around here. There's always evidence of a kill. Nature is messy, and few predators go through the lengths to hide their work. Coyotes just simply aren't one of them. Even looking around the area of these horses, there is zero tracks of anything. No boot prints or paw prints. My dad just tells me I'm putting far too much of my mental energy and focus into trying to figure out what's going on. He says I should just let whatever happen, and nature will sort itself out. I don't feel like this is an act of nature, though. I feel like this is something that demands answers. Too many questions and not enough answers, I guess. It's time for me to do some more homework of my own. This is my very own up-and-close personal account with a Thunderbird. I live in Canada, in the province of Ontario. It took place mid-December of 2011, around 4 a.m., and it was shaping up to be a very green Christmas, as there wasn't snow on the ground at the time. Me, my brother, and a close friend went to smoke a joint out on my balcony, as I live on a mid-upper floor of an apartment building. As we spark the joint, I see this dark black silhouette moving on top of the willow tree, which is on the building property. FYI, my balcony has the best view of it as I see this silhouette fluttering on the top crown canopy of the willow. I grab my brother and friend's attention, asking them if they can make out what the hell I'm seeing, which was a big WTF moment. Thought it was a big black tarp being animated by wind flow. Once all three of us locked into what we were seeing, things like wings, a neck, and the structure of a bird became very apparent. This thing seemed very restless as it kept pacing around the top canopy of the willow. During this time, cell phones had really crappy night support cameras, as I'm sure many of you might remember. Trying to take videos at night with an iPhone 3GS, BlackBerry Bold, LG, and early Android smartphones, if zoomed in, were left horrible, grainy rubbish. We tried to capture it on camera from my balcony, which yielded the above-mentioned results. All three of us ran down to the ground floor. Man, the mere presence of this animal keeps your soul frozen. It's like you can't fathom something like this being thrown to you, visually. It was in that moment that led me to discover what our natural high is in this world. And trust me, whatever effects the weed had yielded long dissipated from when I thought I was looking at a black tarp caught onto the top of the tree. My bro and our friends made it about 6 feet away from the door that leads out from the building. These guys weren't really mentally prepared for something like this, as they both tripped over each other from keeping their eyes glued to it. This animal is quite frightening, especially when you have to come to terms with the reality you now share with it, knowing it's living and breathing as you are. I chose to proceed closer to the tree until I got about 5 feet from it. I couldn't approach any closer, as it shrieked a sound so intimidating and loud. It sounded like an eagle on steroids, but much deeper and sharper in terms of its pitches. I distinctly remember it going into a crouched position, with its tail up, and its head charging downwards with its wings up halfway, opened and curled upwards. This bird is all black, with some red feathering near the face. Never felt that specific feeling of fear before. I ran back towards my bro and friend, and the bird continued to get more restless and aggressive. It literally flapped its wings, hopped up to the next building, which is about 4 stories high, with the willow is about 7 stories, and the distance between both places are less than 15 feet. It paced around there, agitated, then flew off again and disappeared. The wingspan was definitely 16 plus feet easily, and it was about 10 feet tall. A lot of people share this type of experience with themselves. Well, I was lucky enough to share it with 2 others. We told a few of our other friends, and surprisingly, they believed us. I became really obsessed with finding answers. I even thought about calling the avian people who oversee the birds and wildlife, but didn't want them to think we were crazy or lying. Definitely found things that helped me understand more about the Thunderbird in my experience. One thing that stood out the most was that it was at nighttime. I feel like it's evolved and adapted to being nocturnal, and that's why it goes unnoticed during the day. Never seen another bird that active, let alone be in clear sight during the night, besides owls or even bats. Three years ago, I went on a vacation and had one of my best friends pet sit for me. At the time of this, I lived in Nevada and was taking a road trip to see a girlfriend who lived in northern Cali at the time. I was going to be gone for a week, and all was well. I should mention that prior to this, I have never had any experiences that were weird in any way, shape, or form. Life for me has been fairly normal, and I've enjoyed that until now. I don't want strange and creepy things to happen to me, but I guess you don't ask for these things, they just come to you. I had called my friend every few days just to check in to make sure that everything was okay, and that my dog was doing good. I trusted my best friend, and everything had gone great up until the very last day, where I didn't hear from her at all. I didn't think much of it, and when I finally got back to my house later on in the evening, and my friend was on the front porch crying, I get out of the car to greet her, and she's very visibly shaken. I try to talk to her, but she's not really responding. I can see in her eyes there's something really wrong with my dog. I asked her if my dog's okay, and she just shakes her head no, that she doesn't know what happened to her. This is when I start to panic and frantically begin asking, "What do you mean you don't know? Where is she?" Before totally breaking down and sobbing, she looks right at me and tells me she's dead. Before I have a mental breakdown myself, I keep begging her to tell me where she is. She finally points out back and tells me that she's there and that she found her dead this morning and doesn't know what got her. After running to the back with everything I had in me, to only see my dog dead on the ground was one of the most heartbreaking experiences I wouldn't wish on anybody, not even my worst enemy. My dog was my best friend, and it took a long while for me to ever truly get over it. I still miss her so much to this day. I thought she had gotten killed by maybe a pack of coyotes, but she wasn't mangled or bloodied in any way. In fact, she looked rather peaceful, like she had just fallen or collapsed to the ground and died. I tried to move her body around to see if I can find any reason that she would have just suddenly died. When I moved her, her neck moved, and these 2 large holes shone right back at me. There wasn't a drop of blood, but there were clearly 2 puncture wounds in her neck. Both holes, I would say, roughly the size of a number 2 pencil. What out there makes 2 puncture marks in an animal's neck like this? I thought to myself. Well, in the moment, it was more of an emotional meltdown and a lot of tears than it was fear or wondering what killed my dog. Fast forward about 6 months, and the friend that watched my dog actually ended up moving into that same house because I actually moved to northern Cali with my friend that I visited. We went in on a house together to roommate since it fit for both of our jobs. Me and my best friend in Nevada still stayed in very close contact. Sometimes we talked and she would try and confide in me that she's been having some strange experiences in that house. When I would ask her to elaborate more, she had mentioned that she had been hearing banging against her back windows and walls at night, and even went so far as to have a security/surveillance system installed. Then, she went on to tell me that she had been seeing this tiny little gray person with claws trying to break into the back window. She kept saying, I know, it sounds crazy, but I promise this is what's happening." I asked her if she had any of the surveillance footage to show me, and she said that the police had taken it. Shortly after she began to see this short, gray humanoid with claws, she called the police, shown them the footage, and asked what was going on. I guess several other of the neighbors had been calling into the police as well, complaining about similar circumstances. That's when the police force stepped in, confiscated her entire surveillance system and her computer and hard drive. Next thing you know, I stopped getting phone calls from her, and now I can't even reach her. I haven't been able to get a hold of her in a long time. I even sent her a card not too long ago and never heard anything back. I would usually always at least get a text message or phone call, but nothing. I've been listening to your channel for months now, and I don't want to be a doomer, but everything I've heard in your stories and things that have happened to people in your stories is happening to me in real life. I feel like I'm in some sort of fictional horror story. Maybe there's more to my dog being killed than I would like to think. Maybe there's a reason the police confiscated her equipment, and God only knows what happened to her. I hope she's okay. I was invited out to a friend's house a few years back, south of Phoenix. He lives kind of out in the middle of nowhere, but one of the main directions he gave me at the time was that there was a large cattle farm near where he was. He said that this cattle rancher had a bad habit of not being careful enough and, more often than not, would have cattle wander off and die. In fact, it wasn't uncommon to see dead cattle off in the distance. Well, he wasn't wrong. On my way to his house, I probably saw at least 3 dead cows on my way there. This is the same time that I also saw the largest bird in my entire life. Out not too terribly far away from the road was this monstrous-sized white bird, eating away at this dead cow that must have wandered off too far and died. The bird was easily the size of the cattle, and it was certainly a sight to behold. I couldn't stop staring, even while trying to maintain eyes on the road. The entire time I was trying to grasp what kind of bird gets that big. It wasn't at all trying to conceal itself in any way, just feasting away at this dead cow. There were other cars on the road as well, so I'm sure I was not the only one to see it. It was in plain sight, you just had to look off in that direction. It was pulling massive chunks of meat off its bones. It never flew away, just kept feasting of the meat on this cow. I got to my friend's place eventually and told him, "You have giant birds around here that are eating off the dead cows." And I remember he just kind of gave me a blank stare. I don't think he ever knew how to respond. He asked me what I was talking about, and I explained what I saw. I don't think he really believed me. Here I just thought I saw a bird that might be a normal thing around the area, but I guess not. I wouldn't be surprised if all the dead cattle lying around brought in scavenger animals of all kinds. Maybe that was the situation. I don't know. I'm not familiar with any of the species of birds that live out here in the desert, but it was an animal sighting I won't forget. My great-grandfather was a very passionate outdoors man. Well, he still is. Hunter, survivalist, woodsman expert. You know, the kind of guy who lives for the outside world of exploration and adventure. The kind of guy who regularly spends weeks out on hikes at a time and spends more time in solitude than others. He's survived in multiple climates, terrains, and states for that matter, and even other countries. At the age of 103, he's still going for it, incredibly healthy, and a very alert mind. He tells me the secret to his longevity and health is being constantly active and putting in good food into your body. But anyway, he's told me about some things he's found on his adventures before, and nothing is ever too out there. In the last 6 months, I learned of something called the Thunderbird, which is supposedly this large bird that is said to show up before and after a storm. And I was telling my great-grandfather about it and my interest in it, and he told me a couple of different stories. The first was back in the 60s when he was doing a 40-mile hike through the outback of Southern California. Listen, I know it's technically not called the outback, but that's what I like to call it. It's harsh, barren wilderness, so it makes sense. This man will do these kinds of hikes to 1. Stay in shape, and 2. Push his body to its limits to prove he can do it. At one point during his trek, he was attacked by a bird of angelic size that nearly grabbed my great-grandfather in its talons and carried him away. He said that even this bird dwarfed that condor or other large birds. He was able to burn it with a torch he had at the time and scared it off. It was clear that its intent was to kill him. Said the bird was large, built like an eagle, but had very distinctive features to its face. I thought this detail was interesting, that its claws and beak were black, and it looked to have intelligence in its eyes, more than other birds. He even claimed that it came down from the higher Rocky Mountains, probably for hunting a meal for its young. The second experience he had was when he had reached the end of a 3-week hiking expedition in southern Nevada and found what he described as a feather the size of his torso. It was the largest feather he had ever encountered in his life. Said it measured about 4 feet in length and about 10 inches in width. He kept the feather with him for years until he lost everything he owned in a house fire years ago that nearly claimed his life back in the early 80s. I fully believe him. He's not the type to make up stuff like this and is a very honest and hardworking man who comes from the time area where honesty is valued. I haven't asked him about Bigfoot or anything else he might have encountered on his journeys, but I might have to sit down one of these days and pick his brain to find out more if he's got any good stories. He's still out and about doing his thing in the wild, so I don't get as much of a chance to talk to him as I would like. I'll never forget about the time that I went camping with my family in Northern California, where my brother saw something he will never forget. I know that Northern California is home to a lot of things. Giant redwoods, dangerous animals, even the supposed Bigfoot, but I never in a million years would have thought this animal existed. Now, I didn't really think much of this whole phenomenon at the time because I was simply too young and not aware of it. Well, I didn't really spend a lot of time looking into it until my brother sat me down and really told me about it. See, my family loves to just get in a motorhome, and we drive around to different states and find great spots to camp out, whether it be a campground or just off the beaten path. It doesn't really matter to us. We'll find a way to have a good time, no matter what. In this instance, we were driving around Northern California, and I could tell you that I remember we were near the redwoods at the time. I can't quite remember if we had gone through them yet, or if we already did. In fact, I probably couldn't even tell you the exact spot because I was much younger, but I remember that it was that dry desert kind of woods. If you're having a hard time following along, just simply Google what the terrain is like in Northern Cali, and you'll get an idea. It's not thick woods like in the Pacific Northwest. It's more dried out. Anyway, we decided to make our camp spot off the road we were on. There was nobody else around, and we figured it would be the perfect place. As we're getting set up, my parents sent my brother to see if he can find a nearby stream to pitch some water, because we were running low at the time. My brother was 17 then, and was already a very experienced outdoors kind of kid. He carried a knife on him all the time and was very knowledgeable about his general surroundings. It's not like my parents just sent their kid off in the woods without knowing anything. They raised him well. I think my father even spotted a small stream just a few miles away on the way up and wanted to see if it wrapped around. About 20 minutes later, my brother comes back, pale as a ghost, and says that he's seen the largest bird to have ever exist, on prehistoric levels. My parents give him a puzzled look, but I think they ultimately just wrote it off, and probably said something along the lines of, "You probably just mistook a big bird or something." What he explained to me was that it was a giant raven-like bird, but larger than him. It always really stood out to me, because my brother doesn't get scared easily, especially being out in the wilderness so much. We've been out in the woods together since we were just little kids, and to him, that's just a part of nature. Even the times that he's come across mountain lions and even bear, he's hardly fazed because he's just accepted that's just a part of being out in the wild. But this was something that really bothered him, and I distinctly remember him acting different the rest of the day. It was bothersome. The day did go on though, and we ended up getting busy with just camping and living, and so before you know it, we're on our way out of there, and life continues to go on. One thing that's interesting is that my family and I did hear what sounded like a very large hawk very close by. If you know the sound of a hawk, you'll probably understand what I mean. Except the sound of this hawk was so loud. You know how you can tell when you hear an animal sound the general size of it? It's just common sense to know that if it's a larger animal, it's going to have more bass and fullness in its roar, cry, howl, whatever the sound the animal makes. Well, there's a couple of times in that nearby area afterwards we had heard what sounded like a hawk, but much deeper, and sounded like it belonged to a bird much larger. Again, the best way I can describe it accurately is that it had much more bass and vibration to its cry. I guess if you want to call it a hawk cry. I thought it was cool at the time, but I don't really think I put two and two together. The years went on, and my brother and I got to talking again, and he brings up this event. But this time, he went into far greater detail, explaining that as he was traversing down to this ravine to look for the stream, he saw what he described as a mixture of a raven and a hawk, except much larger than him. He said this thing's legs and talons were easily as big as his forearms and hands. Said the head and beak was larger than his own head, and that it was watching him perched up on a tall, dead tree on the other side of the ravine. It really scared him, because he said he's never got a feeling like he did in that moment. He said it's like the bird was sizing him up and decided whether or not to come after him. I possibly don't understand how you could just feel that from a bird, even if it was a rather large bird of prey, but this is just what he relayed to me. The entire time he was in view of this bird, it was closely watching him, almost as if it was calculating his next decision. It never moved from that branch though, and only moved its head to follow him in his movements. He just got a feeling that it wasn't right, and that he shouldn't be there. His gut instinct told him to get out of there. I'm not sure why I did not put much thought into this happening when it did, because this was years and years ago, but for whatever reason, when he retold me this experience of his, it was so much more profound to me. Possibly because I'm older now, which would make sense. He told me that he learned that there's something called a thunderbird, and that people will talk about seeing it all over the United States. When I asked him more about the thunderbird he himself was not quite sure. Some people report seeing a giant white bird. Others talk about seeing a prehistoric pterodactyl-like flying animal. His belief stands firm that he saw something that he believes didn't want to be seen. He really stands by that feeling, especially considering he's never seen a bird of that size and has never heard of a bird that looks exactly like this one did. It had a large pointed beak that dipped down at the end, just like a hawk, and had distinct white markings along the bottom of its neck and chest, but looked to be a mixture of black and brown. If he was guessing size, he would have said around 5 to 6 feet in height. It never spread its wings, so he wasn't able to get an accurate wingspan length. There's plenty of small wild animals out there with the area we were in, and there was nobody else around. I think we pulled off an old road that's no longer used since we were accustomed to just finding random roads that were either deserted or abandoned for best camping spots. It's where you get the best seclusion. He's not scared about it now, but it definitely opened up the book for him that there might be things out there that are undiscovered and that we don't know about yet. Whether it was truly something that had bad intentions, or maybe just an undiscovered bird. Either way, it sounded far more intelligent than just your standard bird. Maybe there is some truth to the whole Thunderbird phenomenon after all. I have some information on the bird situation. In 2001, my husband and I were driving outside of New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, late one night. It was around 2 to 3 in the morning. We had received a call that someone may have spotted our lost beagle. It was October, and we had a quiet moment while we were driving down this dusky country road. The moon was out and did light things up, but it was still dusk-like. All of a sudden, we heard a bird fly above us. It swooped down, soaring above our SUV. We thought it landed on our vehicle because we sort of lifted up a little off the road. Our windows were down, and the bird came so close to our vehicle that we can hear it soar back up. It kind of lifted us up, or felt like it anyway. We both looked at each other and said, "What was that?" We looked up in the sky, and a huge grayish-white-like bird with a wingspan of about 13 to 16 feet soared to a nearby white tree without leaves. It blended in so well, the bird disappeared when it landed on the limb. The tree looked petrified and dead-like. I said to my husband, That is the biggest bird I have ever seen in my life. I called it the Birdman because its legs were so long and dangled like a man's legs. We came home and told our children, who are teenagers, the following morning, and they laughed at us. It almost looked prehistoric. I still find it hard to believe what we saw. When I came home from work this morning, my husband told me he heard about this big bird thing on Coast to Coast. I'm glad we here are not the only ones who have seen this amazing bird. Back in 1996, me and my then girlfriend at the time saw what we believed to be a thunderbird. Being from nearby and traveling a lot through the surrounding states, you tend to pick up on some information and learn a few things here and there, especially from befriending locals and tribesmen alike. The desert is a dangerous place, and much of it is unknown to man. Even many of the natives wouldn't venture to some parts, and that is saying a lot. Let me get back to the story. So, back in 1996, we're driving along Highway 85 when my girlfriend taps me on the shoulder and points off to her side of the car, which is the passenger side. She's asking me, "Do you see that out there?" I briefly glanced over, and out of the distance you could see this large bird flying low to the ground. Far enough away that you couldn't make out specific details, but close enough you could tell that it was a bird, and very large in size. My first thought was that it was a condor or some sort of large bird of prey, but as it ascended back into the sky and flew off in the distance, it was clear this was not the case. This thing had black feathers and resembled more of a large raven kind of bird than anything else. It did look different than a raven though. I want to establish that. As it ascended, you can kind of make out a little bit more of its body, and I remember clear as day white markings on its tail area. The whole sighting maybe lasted 10 seconds at most, but it left my girlfriend and I in awe and wonder that such birds of size live out here in the desert. I could have never imagined birds that big to exist. It's really hard to put a size on it, but I could tell it was larger than the car I was in at the time, which was my 1993 Nissan Sentra. It was a very, very large-sized bird. That's for sure. About 10 years ago, I used to do some minor ranch handing and help around a few farms down in the general New Mexico area where I lived there for a short period of time. One farm that I remember very distinctly had a problem of supernatural proportion. They had a chupacabra problem, and I'm not afraid to come out and say it. I'm going to be blunt about it. I've never believed in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. I never paid attention to Bigfoot or any of that stuff, but what I encountered and experienced on that ranch, along with several others, I can't deny it anymore. There's nothing else this creature could have been, because no animal does what this thing did. It's unnatural, and I know for a fact that there is no predator on this God-given earth that drains the blood of animals like this thing did. For whatever reason, I'm not sure why these things, yes, I say things because there were several of them. It wasn't just one singular thing. They would target the horses, and they would show up really early in the morning. I'm talking around 1 a.m. to 3 a.m., usually. They would show up in groups of 3 to 4 and break into the barn and stables. They managed to successfully take and kill 2 of our horses. When we found them the following morning, they had 2 large holes in their lower neck, and their bodies were completely drained of all blood. It was chilling to know that such an animal could do such a thing. I'll tell you what though, that event really made our owner up his firepower tenfold, and before you know it, we had a bunch of extra hired guards walking around, fully armed with semi-automatic rifles. With all the extra muscle around for protection, I don't think we managed to kill even one of those things. I can tell you that I've probably heard several gunshots almost every night, if not every other night following. You would always know they were around because the horses would start going crazy in the stalls. You could tell they were really freaked out by something. Sure enough, the guards would go by and shine their lights, and there would be these little buggers. I shouldn't say little buggers. These things were probably the size of a small dog with large fangs. They kind of hunched over. The best way I can describe it is it kind of reminded me of a dog when you have a dog sit up and fold its paws in. You would usually only do this if you were to give a dog a treat, but that's what comes to mind. These things were gray and had a short snout with large fangs protruding at the front. Their eyes were large and dark and sunken in. I couldn't tell exactly what color, if there was any color, because the only time I saw them was when they generally reflected eyeshine late at night. They were a true nuisance, and we dealt with them for quite some time. Things died down after a few months, but it was quite a while there that they really tried to get more horses, and they couldn't. Surprisingly, they never came after any of our other livestock. We had chickens, pigs, and several other livestock that, in my opinion, were in a much more vulnerable location than our horses. Maybe these things have it out for horses? Maybe they have a taste for horse meat. I don't know what you want to call it. When we found the two horses' bodies, there wasn't a lick of meat or blood anywhere on the horse. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken bones or gashes of any kind. Just the two large puncture holes in its neck. That's the kind of stuff that keeps you up at night, when you realize that this sort of thing is true. It's like I'm living in the X-Files. It makes you sit back and wonder, what else do they tell you is a lie that is actually really out there and exists right now? Sure, these things never attacked us to try to go after us to my knowledge. I feel like given the chance, if they were backed into a corner, who knows what they would be capable of. Alright, I got two stories for you. First, about 17 years ago, break in a nasty storm, about 9 p.m. in mid-October. My dad and I went out to survey the damage, see if anything had been taken care of before morning. Moon was just about full, above two thin layers of cloud, moving in different directions. Looked cool. My dad noticed it first, told me to look up, saw something dark flying above the first layer of clouds, which, even if they were low, would still have been ridiculously high. It passed in front of the moon. Sounds cheesy, I know, and the silhouette was that of a bird. Looked like some sort of raptor. The tips of its wings extended beyond the width of the moon. It must have been massive. Second, I don't know if it was a thunderbird, but whatever. I seen was a few years ago, and it was about 3 a.m. on a winter night. I couldn't sleep, so I went out for a cigarette and was casually looking around, and it was dead quiet. Not too surprising, because usually around that time it's always dead quiet, because I live in a small northern town. But as I was puffing on my smoke, something caught my eye. The town lights were reflecting on the clouds that I see a huge bird, but this looked like a grayish color. The thing's wingspan must have been more than twice the size of my arm. With a long body, we have owls here, but they are small and turn white in winter. Whatever it was scared the crap out of me, and I rushed inside, making sure to quietly close my door. Then, just stared out of the front window for the next hour, staring into the sky. One night, when I was like 7 or 8, I went onto the roof of my house with my dad and brother to lie down. After about 30 minutes of talking and looking at the stars, we heard a noise that sounded like flapping. Then, we saw a huge bird. I mean, this thing was massive, with a wingspan of maybe 25 to 30 feet. It just flew overhead and into the distance. We never saw it again, though we were pretty spooked. We thought it might have been a condor since they have a pretty massive wingspan, but from doing some research, we found out there are no condors in Texas, and they don't get as big as the bird we saw, so we weren't really sure. We often tell this story to friends. Obviously, some don't believe or don't want to, and others are intrigued by the whole thing, and one of them even said that we saw sounds similar to the thunderbird, which is a creature from Native American legend whose wings are responsible for causing thunder. I don't know about that, but the sounds of the bird's wings flapping still gives me chills to this day. Whether it really was a thunderbird or a condor or some species of a giant bird, I'm not sure. But I know what I saw, as cliche as this is to say, it's the truth. I don't know what it was, but I'm more curious than scared. Did I see a thunderbird? A new species of giant bird. It was heading west from what I remember that night, towards New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. So maybe its home is in the valleys and cliffs and caves over there. Like I said, I don't know. If anyone has any information on this or has had a similar experience, I would appreciate it if you could share it. I don't know what to believe, honestly. There's the part that wants to believe in the stories of the Thunderbird, but the other logical side is trying to tell me otherwise. But there's always that what if. What do you think? Hi, what lurks beneath. I just saw your post about the new topic you're going to feature on your channel. I couldn't help but notice you had mentioned the Chupacabra, and I've been waiting for somebody that I can send my little story to, so I guess you'll be the first. This story has to do with my grandfather and my grandfather's father, who owned big farms and ranches down in Mexico. Both of them claimed to have eaten chupacabra meat, actually, when they were younger, as these beings were frequent visitors on the ranch. My grandfather tells me that it was commonplace to find these creatures drowned in the nearby large pond that the horses and other livestock would drink from. I thought that to be interesting. I wonder what caused them to drown. My grandfather wasn't sure, but his dad and grandfather would just take care of the creature, cut them up, and eat the meat. Said the meat had a weird consistency to it, like it was its own thing. Much the same way seafood and clam meat is still meat, but it's its own thing. There was a time where these creatures became so bad to deal with that they actually had to trick all of them into going into a large barn where the other livestock was. They were somehow able to successfully trap them all inside and then burn the barn down, killing all the chupacabra inside as well as most of their livestock. My grandfathers are crazy men, and I don't mean crazy up in the head. I mean crazy like they've been through stuff and have mental strength and fortitude to endure. To them, it was just another part of growing up tough and living that lifestyle. When he had first mentioned the whole chupacabra thing to me, I laughed in his face, but when he sat me down and told me his stories, I was taken aback by them. Anyway, I just wanted to share with you this brief bit of information. I was going to share it with a couple of other big YouTube narrators, but I don't think any of them are really doing chupacabra-focused content. Oh well, maybe your audience will appreciate my grandfather's experiences. My name is Mark, and I'm part Cuban. My father is full-blooded Cuban, and currently lives in Cuba, while my mother is half Italian, half Portuguese. My mother and father met, had me, and then separated when I was really young. I didn't really grow up knowing my father since I moved to the United States with my mother when I was very young. She remarried very quickly to an American man, and I didn't really have much of a relationship with my real father growing up. That is, until my later teens. I'm now in my early 30s, and I visited my father sometimes, but he mainly comes up here to visit every now and then, and we have a fantastic relationship. All of the family matters aside, he deals with a common problem that many local farmers in his area deal with: chupacabra. To give a little lesson to those that know nothing about the chupacabra, Spanish for goat sucker. These are beings that steal and kill livestock and suck the blood out of their bodies. My father has lost well over a dozen goats and several other livestock to these creatures over the years. I know this because when I call him, he's often complaining about it, not having the money, and means to barter for more. I didn't really get to start to listening to creepypastas and scary stories until I was older, so once I started to learn about this stuff while my dad's thing was going on, it was just kind of ringing a bell in my head. I've always been a big believer in cryptids and things you can't see, and having this happen firsthand is just downright terrifying. Even though I'm not experiencing it, my father is, and it is very, very real for him. He's just a simple man trying to get by on life, and these creatures are coming and killing off his animals. I don't think I really started to talk to him about them and really get his side of the story until I watched some chupacabra stuff myself, reading a little bit of research and stories as well as watching encounters with them. That's when I decided to talk to my father more about it, since he does believe they are chupacabras as well, but knows nothing of them beyond what he experiences with them. By that, I mean he hasn't read any encounters, hasn't been exposed to our American pop culture. He doesn't watch any documentaries or any sort of thing like that. He explains to me, though, that they have really large black eyes and long, droopy fangs. Tells me that they are of the devil, and that they look like they've come from hell. These are the descendants of the night, and they are here to scare and torment. I'm agnostic, but my father is very Catholic, and tells me he prays against them every day. Not too many months after all this started happening, a few of them, I guess, tried to break into his house by scratching at the windows and doors. Petrified with fear, all my father could do is pray that these things will leave him alone. They still will come during the night to try to get into his house, wiggling his door handle and looking for weak spots to enter. My father doesn't believe that these things wouldn't try and kill him, so he keeps everything securely locked. I'm really worried about him because this is still an ongoing occurrence, even as I write this to you. I've tried to get him out here to the United States, but he just doesn't want to leave his farm. I don't know what to do. I usually don't tell a lot of people this, but I personally believe that I've seen a dead chupacabra on the side of the road. Last year, my job entailed me to drive from different locations across New Mexico. I've been to Nevada and around the area. I prefer that my job details stay more private, as I'm not comfortable sharing any of that sensitive information. I will say though, at the time, I smoked like a chimney, and cannot smoke in my company vehicle in which I drove. So, I would often make frequent stops along the side of the road to light one up. It's not what I wanted to do, but I didn't have a choice. I do remember this event quite well though. I was probably about 80 or so miles outside of Tucson, headed east, and it was getting a little dusky outside. I pulled over on the side of the road for a smoke, and I thought I would sit outside my car and enjoy the cool evening breeze. Well, what am I kidding? It's Arizona. There ain't nothing cool about it. But it was at least a breeze nonetheless. It had been at least 4 or 5 hours since my last smoke break anyway, since I was trying to make good time to my next location. I figure I had a good 5 or so minutes to spare since I was going over the speed limit. I'm sitting there, smoking my cigarette, looking off in the distance when my eye catches something on the ground, probably about 50 feet away from me in the dirt. I don't know why I didn't catch it at first, but it looked to be like a dead animal or some sort. Not really anything surprising, since animals die all the time out here. The conditions are extreme, and this is a busy road. But the more I'm looking at it, the more my brain is having a hard time registering what animal this could be. My brain just can't configure the puzzle pieces right, and it's left me confused. After about 30 seconds of trying to figure this out, I just say screw it in my mind and throw my cigarette down. I walk on over there to see exactly what animal this is, and I'm surprised. I thought that coming up close to it, I would be able to rightfully say it was just a mangled coyote that had gotten ran over by a big truck, but this was an animal I was not familiar with. I have a couple of close native friends that I told the story to, and they told me that it sounds like I saw a dead skinwalker that had gotten hit by a semi-truck. I don't know. All the depictions I've ever seen of skinwalkers don't look anything like what I saw. This thing was smaller. Well, I don't want to say smaller, because it was still a larger animal. I'm going to tell you the size of a dog, because that makes the most sense, but more like a pit bull-sized dog. The only problem is it had really short back legs, and long gangly forearms that formed into tiny 3-fingered hands that looked to even have claws on the end of them. It was very humanoid looking in the body, and the face was also much flatter than a dog's. It had 2 large fangs protruding from its mouth with sharper, rigid teeth in between. It looked to be whatever animal it was, probably had mange or something. It looked to be somewhat fresh, the body, and was probably ran over in the last 12 to 15 hours, if I had to guess. Part of its body was contorted and crushed because it looks like it was the spot that had been ran over or hit. Part of its body was completely crushed, which is what I believe it died from, and probably got knocked over or flew over off the road. I want to talk about the fangs though, because I've never in my life seen an animal with 3 to 4 inch canine-like fangs hanging out of its mouth. This thing looked like a little mini vampire with exaggerated things. Although physically it looked like a mixture of a dog and a human, if that makes sense. I'm not talking about no werewolf or anything like that. It looked more like a science experiment gone wrong. Like somebody was trying to make a monster and fuse dog DNA with human, and it somehow got screwed up and died. I don't know. Between the general abnormality of the monster and the fact that it was mangled from death by a semi-truck, I couldn't give you an actual answer. Skinwalker or not, this thing was freaky to look at. I probably stood there and spent more time observing than I really should have. In fact, I probably freaked myself out too much, because the more questions I had, the more I wanted to look at it. The more I wanted to look at it, the more questions I had. I had probably sat there for about 10 minutes before I left. It wasn't until a little later on that I kind of put 2 and 2 together and realized it was probably a chupacabra, if anything. It was after I watched the show on them that I really saw the resemblance and put it in my head that that is what it had to be. I didn't think they were real, but this thing must have been traveling at night and somehow gotten smacked by a truck oncoming. I guess I'm lucky that I saw it before the vultures and other wildlife ate through it. The weird thing was, though, that there were no flies or anything buzzing around it. There was also no smell or odor, and it was a blazing hot day. Just 2 things that stick out to me that are odd. I'll let you be the judge. Make of it what you will, but that's my experience, and it's one of those things that's going to forever kind of creep me out.